Chapter 18 of D99 by H.B. Fyfe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain.
Chapter 18. Was it the pain in his head that made everything seem to sway? Or was it the swaying that made his head hurt? Taranto opened his eyes slowly. For 2 or 3 minutes, in the darkness, he did not understand what he saw. Gradually, comprehension developed. He was on a litter again, and the bearers were descending a rough track into a shallow valley. There was no sign of the city, or of any other landmark even vaguely familiar. Jagged rocks formed a ridge to his left, curving around to enclose the depression. Other rocky buttes, he saw through slitted eyes, projected from the barren rubble of the valley floor. There seemed to be little sand, unless it had blown down into the lower areas. Cautiously, letting his head roll with the lurching motion of the bearers, he learned that another group was ahead. He thought they must be guarding Myers. The red-uniformed officer marched just preceding Taranto's litter. That meant that there must be 2 soldiers behind, out of his view. What now, he asked himself. It was a good try, but it didn't work out. It seemed hopeless to attempt anything further until he found out where he was. Nor would it do any harm to learn how he was. They must have crowned him beautifully. He tried to move his arms and legs slightly without being obviously restless. Nothing felt broken. There was just the sore throbbing behind his left ear. Were they taking him and Myers further into the desert to make sure they could properly be reported dead? Or was the party on its way back to the city? Taranto moved about stealthily, as the litter heaved from side to side and bounced about with the efforts of his bearers to negotiate outcroppings of rock. He was surprised that his arms and legs were not tied. He wondered how long he had been out cold. Perhaps the Sissokans believed he really was dead from that spear across the skull. You shouldn't have underestimated that guy just because you dropped him a few times, he told himself. You caught on to the difference, but he learned it from you. From ahead and lower on the path came voices. There was a brisk breeze, but Taranto thought he could recognize Myers giving vent to an outraged whine. Wonder how much of a grudge they'll hold, he thought. Some of them must be lumped up pretty good. He was beginning to locate a number of scrapes and bruises on his own sturdy frame. He wondered if it might be best to take things easy until they reached either their desert destination or the area outside the city, according to which way they were headed, and then offer to bribe the officer in charge. It would probably be too risky. He would have to rely on large promises, and they had already caught him in a crude whopper. Whatever the case, it would be unwise to open negotiations without finding out what the Sissokan commander looked like. Taranto seemed to recall pasting the fellow pretty thoroughly. He caught a few words of Terran, blown back to him by a random gust. Myers was complaining about being too tired to walk any further. It did not sound as though he were making his point. Of course, Taranto realized. I must be in his stretcher. Mine was busted. Now the slob will put it on me for making him bump his rump along this trail. The image was not without humor. Contemplating it gave Taranto a momentary satisfaction. Well, they knew Myers was alive, even if they might not be sure about Taranto himself. Perhaps they were merely saving both Terrans for a longer jail term. Taranto hoped that the Sissokans had nothing more unpleasant in mind. The remarks he had used earlier in his attempt to bluff the officer could be used for inimical purposes by anyone who cared to point out that Sissokan knowledge of Terran physiology was scanty. Then what? Taranto decided that he would be foolish to worry along that line at the present. What he needed was an idea for getting loose again. He speculated for a few minutes upon his chances of backtracking to the scene of his attempted escape. Somewhere near there, in whichever direction it was, a spaceship would be landing. If they ain't been and gone already, he thought. In his supine position on the stretcher, he was able to see the sky without moving. That was why the distant trail of light was visible to him for some moments before any of the Sissokans could notice it. I can't wait it out, after all, he realized. The ship would be heard presently, and the flare of its braking rockets would arouse the guards. Taranto peeked around again, and saw that they were nearing the foot of the slope. Following the natural motion of the bearers, he let himself roll a little too far each time the litter swayed. The Sissokans struggled to compensate while scrabbling for safe footholds on the hard, slippery surface. In the end, one of them slipped. The litter crashed down. Taranto added a twist to the natural force of gravity so that he rolled downhill. The fallen bearer picked himself up, mumbling something in Sissokan that sounded remarkably belligerent. One of the others moved to recover the stretcher. Taranto kept on rolling. At the first yell, he gave up the pretense and regained his feet with a lithe bound. For the next 60 seconds, he needed every last smidgen of concentration to escape taking a fatal spill on the sloping rocks. Hurtling downward in great leaps, he was forced to hurdle large rocks because his velocity prevented him from changing course by even a foot. Once he skidded, thinking his time had come. Near the bottom, where the incline curved to meet the horizontal, he did go down, plowing up a spatter of loose chips and pebbles. He was up and running again, without quite knowing how. A dark shape loomed up before him, a rock twice his height. Before passing it, he took the chance of looking back. The litter party was in a state of confusion. The officer and two soldiers were bounding after him, slanting away on a more reasonable path. One Sisokan was still in the process of picking himself up, and most of the others were either milling about or just beginning to heed their leader's shouts to follow Taranto. The intention of yelling to Myers flashed across his mind, but he dismissed it as being useless. A hasty glance in the opposite direction showed him the fire trail setting behind another ridge to his front. The valley bore a certain resemblance to a meteor crater. Taranto sprinted past the huge rock and bore right toward the distant ridge. He would try to locate the ship if and when he reached the ridge. The immediate necessity was to keep out of the clutches of the burial party. Running in the starlit darkness was risky, as he soon found. The ground was strewn with occasional patches of loose stone, traps of nature suitable for tripping the unwary or causing a sprain. The only thing that kept Taranto reckless was the sounds of pursuit behind him. He had gone about 200 yards when he realized that some of the rock scattering noises came from his right more than from behind. The Sisokan were better runners than he, and used to the local terrain besides. He could not tell whether they had seen the trail of the spaceship, or if so, whether they connected it with him. But they know enough to head me off whichever way I go, he thought. He came unexpectedly to a patch of sand, and swore as he felt his speed slacken. A desperate glance over his shoulder revealed no pursuers, though he knew they were there somewhere. He could see two runners who had flanked him on the right 50 yards off, and these forced him into bearing away from his desired course. Instead of passing to the right of a tall outcropping of rock ahead, he turned left. It took him farther from the direction of the spaceship, but there was no help for it. He floundered over a low dune of sand, and then was out of it and running on flat ground. He circled to the left of the hill, hearing a howl from the rear. Must have seen me against the open valley, thought Taranto. They sound closer than I like. He ran on, scanning the shadowed rocks towering over him for a place to climb. It was a foregone conclusion that the two flankers would be on the lookout for him as he came around the hill. At last he thought he saw a way up, a sloping ledge leading to a small plateau before the rock reared higher in a sheer cliff. Up he went, on hands and toes. The rock was ridged, but in the wrong direction, and he slipped to hands and knees twice before he was up. He slowed to a quick walk as he reached the level expanse. It was 10 or 12 feet above the valley floor and curved off to the right around the base of the cliff. Taranto was panting by now, but his main reason for slowing was that he wanted to make less noise until he spotted the two Sisokans he expected to meet. The broad ledge he was following dipped, rose a few feet, and dipped again to less than 10 feet above the level ground. Taranto flattened himself suddenly. The two Sisokans came loping along the shadowy edge of the outcropping, spears at the ready. From around the cliff sounded a call. The first soldier threw back his head to answer. As the howl left his throat and masked the noise of the Terrans scrambling, Taranto launched himself upon the back of the second. They went down with a thump upon hard rocks. Taranto, saving his ribs from being caved in by fending himself off from a jagged rock with his forearm, kicked out and caught the downed Sisokan in the belly. As the soldier subsided, the Terran snatched up the spear and rose to face the other one. It had all gone so fast that the leader was just turning back. Perhaps he thought merely that his companion had fallen, but the stocky silhouette of the spacer disabused him of that idea. He advanced, with the point of his spear weaving about menacingly. "You think you're good with that stick, eh?" growled Taranto. "We'll try this for something different." Gripping his spear near the head, he swung the heavier butt like a bat, putting as much power into it as he could. It was crude, but he knew better than to try to match skills with a soldier trained to the use of the weapon. The butt cracked resoundingly against the shaft of the Sisokan spear, tearing it from the grip of his leading hand. Taranto's own hands were numbed by the shock. He dropped his spear and slid inside the Sisokan's one-handed grip before it could be reinforced. The feint of a left hook to the belly made the soldier relinquish his weapon completely and grapple with the spacer. Taranto found his left arm entwined with the right of the Sisokan. He tried twice to punch to the body with his free hand, but was smothered. Before he could think of it himself, the Sisokan stamped hard upon his toes. "Bastard!" spat the spacer. He butted, successfully but profitlessly. He rabbit-punched twice with his right hand, reaching around under the soldier's armpit. Only when he gouged at a large black eye did the defending arm come up. Taranto set his feet and banged 3 times to the midsection, getting plenty of body twist into his motion. He found himself holding a very limp Sisokan, who slid down as the spacer stepped back. Taranto sucked in a gasping breath. He staggered aside to pick up the spears, feeling better now that he was armed, no matter how primitively. He had hardly straightened up when he saw the officer round the edge of the little butte, a mere 50 feet away. The Sisokan hesitated at the sight of the Terran standing over 2 of his soldiers, and Taranto threw one of the spears. The trouble was that he did not know how to handle one. A spear, after all, was not standard equipment on a spaceship. The point twisted away from the target, and much of the force went into a slow spin. The officer hissed a disdainful comment and caught the weapon out of the air with one hand. Taranto stooped for a rock, which he hurled with more effect. It shattered with a fine crack against the cliff near enough to the Sisokan to make him throw himself behind a boulder for cover. Taranto left him in the middle of a yell to his soldiers and sprinted off into the open valley. Carrying the spear did not help matters much, but he thought the Sisokans might regard it as a more dangerous deterrent than he knew it to be in his untrained hands. The next time he looked around, he saw that he could rejoice in a splendid lead of 200 yards. On the other hand, the officer now had a numerous group with him, and would probably get organized at last. Taranto slowed to a jog, to save himself against the time when they should begin to catch up. "Taranto!" said a small voice. He broke automatically into a dead run without even looking around. "Wait, Taranto!" called the little voice. "Look up, for the spy eye!" The spacer slowed as understanding burst upon him. He looked back and saw a spark of light gaining on him. It arrived and hovered over his head. "It may still work," the voice informed him. "The ship is down. I told them what happened and they're putting up a helicopter." "Where's Myers?" "I don't know," said Taranto. "Back on the ridge, I guess." "Look, I can't just stand here until that copter comes. I'll be a pincushion." "Head for that hill ahead, about a quarter mile," said the voice from the little flyer. "I'll guide them there." The Sisokans were running now, spreading out in a well-drilled manner. Taranto boosted himself into high speed again. The hill ahead was more toward the center of the valley. If the pursuers were aware of some connection between his flight and the position of the spaceship, they would be satisfied to have him heading away from the ridge enclosing the valley. Taranto hoped that they would not worry enough to turn on a burst of speed, for he was convinced that they could outrun him. He was right. He reached the steep slopes of the hill with a bare 50 yards left of his lead, and he was on the point of foundering at that. His knees buckled for an instant as he hit the first rise, and he saved himself from pitching on his face only by thrusting out the butt of the spear he carried. Somehow he made it another 50 feet up the slope, hearing the voice beside his ear say, "To the right, Taranto. Head for that flat spot. Here comes the helicopter." He wiped salty sweat from his eyes with the back of one hand and looked up. A large, quietly whirring shape shadowed the stars. It dropped rapidly toward him as a howl broke out behind him. Taranto took the spear in both hands, holding it at one end, and sent it whirling end over end at the closing Sisokans. The whole center of the group dropped flat to let it swish over their heads. Before they could rise, the helicopter reached Taranto. It came down so fast it bounced against the ground. Someone held out a hand to Taranto and yelled to him to jump. He was hauled into an open cockpit. Someone took a death grip on the waistband of his pants and he felt the helicopter climb. He wiggled around until he could get his knees under him. There were two spacers in the cockpit of what was obviously an auxiliary craft from a spaceship. One of them, a very long-eared type with a narrow head, looked as if he had been born in some stellar colony. The other had a broad, bland face of an Oriental Terran. "Where is the other one?" asked the latter. Taranto crept between the seats to which they were strapped before answering, for there were only chains at the open sides. He got his bearings and directed the long-eared pilot to the ridge where he had rolled out of the litter. It nearly broke his heart to see them reach it in less than a minute. "There may be guards with him," he warned. "Maybe he took off too." "We shall see," said the broad-faced spacer. He ran a spotlight along the ridge, stopped, and brought it back to bear upon a lonely figure. Myers stood up and waved. No Sisokan was in sight. The officer must have taken them all with him. He knew what he was doing, thought Taranto. The guy's still here. The helicopter eased down to hover over a large rock. Myers climbed laboriously upon it and was hauled aboard. Taranto squeezed himself back behind the seats to make room. "It's about time you got here," puffed Myers. "I'm worn out." Taranto said nothing as the craft rose in the air and swooped off toward the spaceship. Someday Myers would ask how he had gotten away from the Sisokans. When it happened, Taranto swore to himself he would show the slob.
End of chapter 18.